This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Shifting a little money here, a little there, hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance. They'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. Hey, What Next listeners? It's Mary Harris. Before we get to today's episode, I have a favor to ask. This relationship feels slightly one-sided. Just me talking to you all the time. We want to change that. We have a listener survey we want you to fill out. It's going to really help us do the show better. And we'll hear from you. What you want, what you need, what you love, what you hate. All of that stuff. You can find the survey in our show notes for all the latest episodes, or you can visit slate.com/whatnextsurvey. Okay, on to the show. David, I'm kind of wondering, how often did you hear the phrase, "this election feels like 2016" Tuesday night?
Oh, man. I lost count at some point, but a lot.
David Graham is a staff writer over at The Atlantic.
I was getting messages from people a lot, especially earlier in the night, being like, is this 2016 or is this 2020? I can't tell what the feeling is. And people were trying to figure out, is this just like, are we waiting for the blue shift or is this really what it is? Which I thought was an interesting thing.
We all know how the night ended. Donald Trump is the president-elect. The Senate's flipped. The MAGA movement is on the verge of having its hands on every lever of power available to them. But this question about how Trump's victory is going to be different from his last, I kept thinking about it. Honestly, to a lot of people, I think 2016 felt like a fluke. It's not like Trump won the popular vote. But this time, he did. As I thought more and more about this, I went back to compare what election night looked like the first time Trump won and compare it to what happened this week. To me, the differences were so striking. Back in 2016, Trump entered the stage at his victory party, accompanied by his family and his true believers, Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon. This time around, he had the Republican establishment behind him.
Political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
The Speaker of the House was there. High-powered Republican operatives.
They're great. Everybody up here is great. Everybody up here is very special.
You know, I think it's interesting. In 2016, Trump's victory came as such a shock. And that wasn't true this year. You know, we knew that he could win because we had seen it once before. But I also think it feels a little bit different in that then the idea of a Trump presidency was so remote that it was impossible to really understand. And now I think we have a better sense what it will be like, although maybe not a full one.
Today on the show, why this year felt a lot like 2016, but Trump 2.0 is going to hit different. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. So one of the places I saw folks playing this idea of 2024 feeling like 2016 was Twitter. And one of your colleagues, Tim Alberta, was talking about it. He noted, though, that this year looks different because in our modern era of tight elections, this election was kind of a landslide for Trump. What do we know about where the biggest shifts were? Or is it really just like global?
I think it's across the board. We're still getting some of these numbers in. And so I hesitate to draw like big demographic statements, but it just feels to me like Trump won everywhere. And it wasn't like he flipped one place. It wasn't like he flipped one demographic. He just did better across the board in urban areas, in rural areas, with white voters, with black voters, with Latino voters. I think we're going to see a lot of focus on younger men. It does seem like he got a big shift there, but I don't think that's all of it. He just won a bigger portion of the vote. This is, of course, the first time he's won the popular vote in his 3 tries.
In 2016, was it really about suppressed turnout and fewer people coming to the polls, and that allowed this opening for other folks, people who maybe hadn't been voters before, to make their voices heard? And that may be something that changed or is different this year, or maybe is the same.
I don't know. I mean, in 2016, there's this sort of retroactive look, and you say, well, Hillary Clinton was always pretty unpopular, and it was a strange election, and Democrats had held the White House for 8 years, and Trump had this unique media environment, and he didn't win the popular vote. He sort of stumbled into this electoral college advantage, blah, blah, blah. And you can sort of retroactively think, well, this is kind of a fluky election. And I'm trying to figure out how to think about 2016 now from the vantage point of 2024, where Trump, people know more what he's like. You know, they've experienced 4 years of him. Kamala Harris was better liked than Hillary Clinton and didn't have this sort of years of baggage. And Trump won the popular vote. So I don't know if I need to rethink my 2016 analysis, or if this is just a different election. We saw something different happen.
Yeah, different fundamentals on the ground.
Yeah.
Would you characterize what happened this year as happening because of an emerging gender divide, an emerging economic divide, or some combination of both? Or maybe we don't know.
It's too early for me to feel confident about any of those. I mean, I do think the gender gap, maybe, and the economic question intersect. Harris talked a lot about abortion in her campaign. And clearly it wasn't the thing that was most important to voters, even though Democrats had hoped for this Dobbs effect. But when you look at the abortion referenda that were on state ballots, they did really well. Most of them passed. They passed in red states. One failed in Florida, but only because it needed a supermajority. So it's like on these issues, people do care about them. And it does seem like women turned out for them. They just didn't carry Harris to victory.
Yeah. Another thing that's notable to me is how deeply blue states seem to have shifted right since Trump entered politics. Or maybe it's just since the last 4 years. I really can't tell which. But it was so striking to me, a New Yorker, to see that here, Democrats went from a margin of 24 points in 2016 to 23 points in 2020 to 12 points in 2024. So it's just like the floor drops out from 2020 to 2024. Is that just about general dissatisfaction?
I think some of that is an inflation question. People are upset about the economy and they're punishing the incumbent. But I don't think it can all be that, since it does, we see it accelerating versus 2020, but we've seen a little bit of this the last couple cycles. It does seem like Trump is attracting more people in that way. I think it's interesting to see voting less polarized by race in that way. And if you had told Democrats 10 years ago, I think, that you would see less racially polarized voting dynamic, they would have thought, well, this is good. This must mean we're making progress on things, and this is going to redound to our benefit.
You mean you're talking about how Latino voters seem to have gone for Trump?
Right, exactly. But instead what we see is these demographics voting for Trump. They're breaking the opposite direction. They're not voting on racial issues. Racial identity is not apparently the most important thing. Instead, people are saying, well, Trump says these things, but I like what he says on the economy, or I like his tone, and I'm willing to give that a shot.
The last time Trump was president, he had control of both chambers of Congress. It's totally possible that will be the result this time, too. Do you think there will be a difference in how Trump manages that strength? Or are there also structural things in place that will allow him to manage that strength differently?
Yeah, I think he'll control Congress in a much more real way than he did in 2017 and 2018.
Why do you say that?
He complained about Republicans in the House and Senate at the time, and I used to dismiss that. But in retrospect, he was right. I mean, these guys were the old guard of the party. It was Mitch McConnell still towards the peak of his strength. It was Paul Ryan, who was a totally different form of conservatism than Trump. And so they were ostensibly on the same team, but they had really different priorities. They weren't interested in building the wall, even if they would be willing to go along with it. They did want to cut taxes, which is the one thing they managed to do. They were interested in having repealing Obamacare as a campaign talking point, but they weren't really interested in what might come after that, and neither was Trump. So that failed too. And so over and over again, you saw them kind of foiling Trump on these things. But now Trump is going to have a House Speaker who is devoted to him, who tried to overturn the election for him 4 years ago. You're going to have a Senate leader who is much more beholden to him, no matter who that is. And so I think he'll be more effective at controlling them. He also, having been through 4 years of this, knows a little bit more how it works. And his interest in this is minimal, but I just think he's going to have a team that is thinking about how to move the House and Senate more.
There's one more sobering parallel to 2016, which is this is the second time Democrats have put forward a woman candidate for president, and they've lost. What do you make of that?
It's interesting because again, thinking back to 2016, people could say, well, Hillary was a woman, but she ran a campaign that was real identity based, and she also had all this baggage. So maybe it's unusual.
Right. She was also a Clinton.
Right. And Harris runs this campaign that so specifically tries to avoid talking about identity. She acknowledges it, but you're not going to get I'm with her kind of stuff. They just don't foreground it. And then she loses. And maybe that means that she just lost because any Democrat would have lost, and that there was no one who would have won this race. And obviously, there is some effect of a misogyny on the voting, and we don't know how big. But I think regardless of what effect it had, it's going to make primary voters hesitant to seriously consider a female candidate again in the Democratic Party. And I think that's, that's bad news.
After the break, Trump made a whole lot of promises on the campaign trail. Which ones will he keep?
Hey, it's me, the Quenchies. I'm that late afternoon craving you just can't shake. Wait, what's that? Welch's Grape Aid? No! Made with real fruit and no added sugar, nothing answers the call of the Quenchies like Grape Aid. Got the Quenchies? Grab a Grape Aid in your juice aisle.
What do Mattel, Banana Republic, ButcherBox, and Glossier all have in common? They power their businesses with Shopify. Shopify is the most innovative and scaled commerce platform on the planet that also happens to have the best converting checkout on the planet. And that's no industry secret. That's Shopify. Learn more at shopify.com/enterprise.
Can we talk about how the differences between 2016 and 2024 might result in a different kind of presidency? Because Donald Trump is certainly saying a lot of things as part of his campaign, a lot of promises about what he's going to do on day one. It may make sense to just run through with my listeners what those promises are.
Well, we've got promises of retribution against all sorts of people, the press, Mark Milley, various critics of his in the Republican Party.
Mark Milley called him a fascist.
Right. Mark Milley called him. This is a guy who Trump handpicked to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And now he said he should maybe be executed. He's talking about going after Adam Schiff, who's now the senator-elect from California. He said the same thing about Nancy Pelosi. He said anybody who is involved in election interference, which he defines very broadly to mean, prosecuting him, criticizing him, being in the press, airing critical interviews. So
he feels like an inverse Santa Claus. He has a list.
Right, exactly. He knows who's been naughty, and that's all he's interested in.
Yeah.
We've got tariff promises as well. He's going to levy big tariffs on people.
And this is something that a lot of people were like, hold it, brother. Like, that's going to be a big deal. Like, basically, like, every economic egghead was like, hold it, this will end up being a huge sales tax on Americans. It's going to have really bad impacts on people. He just blew through them during the election, saying like, no, it'll be fine. I'm doing it.
I think he's going to flinch. I think he's going to flinch on the tariffs in particular because he loves the stock market. And if he attempts to levy huge tariffs, the stock market is going to react negatively. And I think that's going to scare him. I mean, I think the same thing about mass deportation, where I think he'll do some high profile actions and then kind of declare victory and move on. But it's hard to say. And it's hard to say who will be kind of in charge of executing those things. Trump may lose interest, but, Stephen Miller, for example, is the point person for that. Miller's wanted to do this I've known Stephen Miller since 2007, and he's wanted to do this sort of thing since then. And I don't think he's going to lose interest or get bored and get distracted.
Yeah. I mean, you're raising this issue, which is true, which is like, this is not the first time Trump has had a lot of big goals for his time in the White House. And in the end, last time around, he didn't complete his wall. He didn't get Mexico to pay for the work that was done. He didn't beat China in a trade war or revive American manufacturing. You can actually make the case that Joe Biden did a lot to revive American manufacturing with stuff like the CHIPS Act. So is there reason to believe that he's actually going to be more effective this time around?
I think one thing that's interesting about the first Trump term is that he really did try to enact a lot of his promises. And he often just failed on them. He didn't get them done. And there were a bunch of reasons for that. One was Congress wasn't necessarily willing to play ball. One was his own inattention and inability to care. Like, he never really engaged on some sort of Affordable Care Act substitute. And one was the people around him who really made an effort to soft pedal a lot of it. I don't think he's going to have people who want to soft pedal around him. He's going to have people who, if anything, want to sort of accelerate that. And he's going to have a more cooperative Congress. His inattention to things that's him. That's who he is. And so I don't think that's going to change. But I think that those other two factors mean that he will at least have a more focused attempt at some of these things than he did before. They really learned this personnel as policy idea. Like, they really, truly do believe that it's personnel as policy, and that's where they got screwed the last time around, and they're not going to let it happen again.
Yeah, enter Project 2025.
Yep.
Something that's different this time around is that the Supreme Court has just issued this ruling that basically gives presidents a whole lot of immunity from prosecution for actions within their constitutional authority. How do you imagine that ruling is going to influence Trump's behavior? Or do you think Trump was never thinking that far ahead? And so it just protects him for what he was already doing?
We have all these instances of Trump trying to do things that were against the law while he was president, or that his lawyers thought were against the law. And the lawyers saying, wait, you totally cannot do that. And now there may not be a lawyer who's as willing to stand up to Trump, but also they don't have to worry about that. So if Trump says, I want to fire Robert Mueller, or, if I want to fire some special counsel like Robert Mueller, there's no reason why he would, hesitate on that now. His White House counsel isn't going to say, wait, no, don't do that. They're going to say, sure, of course, you can do that. The Supreme Court says so. And clearly there's not any political mechanism, especially if Democrats don't hold the House, for you to be held accountable. Go right ahead. It's really amazing. Like, as we're talking through this, just like thinking about all of the various add-on effects of this election. And I keep thinking more, and you keep reminding me of more. And it just seems to go on forever.
Yeah. And I think one of the frustrating things for me as someone who's a giant nerd and kind of follows these things really closely is how the presidency actually impacts people's lives and how people feel it impacts their lives. Because I think a lot of people have a legitimate grievance of like, what the hell? These interest rates are so high. My kid can't buy a house. They can't have the life I want them to. I don't feel like America's working for me. But they're the kinds of things that I'm not sure a president controls.
Right. You would see interviews occasionally with voters who blamed Joe Biden for abortion restrictions because Dobbs was decided while he was president, which
Whoa.
is an example of how that doesn't filter through. But I mean, I also think, to your point, like, people sort of imagine that, you know, the president has the like raise gas prices button and the raise egg prices, and they're just jacking it up, and they wouldn't knock it down if they could. And of course they would.
And I have to say, like, I think sometimes people hear us talking about stuff like this and they think we're condescending. Do you know what I mean? Like, I want to be so transparent about that,
sure,
which is
yeah.
like, I think this conversation can feel really disgusting to people. Like, I am hurting and you are not seeing me. And that's real. And that's how we got here.
Yeah, I think people are like reasonably voting against inflation, and they're voting against an economy that isn't working for them, but they're going to get something else. They're going to get a lot of other things, like the things you're saying, that they didn't necessarily vote for, or they didn't think they were voting for, or wasn't top of mind. And I'll be curious to see how they react to that. You know, I think people voted for Trump, not for exactly the same reasons, but for sort of analogous reasons in 2016. And then once they saw him as president, they voted against him they voted against his party in 2018. They voted against him in 2020. They voted against his party in 2022 when he thrust himself to the center of the race again. And it was only after they dealt with 4 years of inflation that they sort of turned on this, and they'd had enough and they were willing to give another shot. I will be curious to see whether the same thing happens again, or if he's kind of shifted the country to a place where that doesn't happen.
You know, one difference I've noticed from 2016 to now is that in 2016, there was a pretty quick response of people who wanted to see themselves as the guardians of democracy, whether that was by marching on Washington in a pink hat or rushing to an airport to help a Muslim migrant. Like, there were people who were like, sign me up. I'm part of the hashtag resistance. I'm not feeling that as much. For me personally, I feel like that's because I'm not sure if those people know where to go right now, because the defeat for Democrats has been so thorough. But I'm curious how you think about it. This tiredness, this, it's a little bit of like an empty echoing to me.
I do think it's early. But I mean, like, everyone I've talked to in activist groups is freaked out about this. I mean, they just think that people are worn out. They spent 4 years doing this. They worked really hard. They put in their time. Maybe they put in it again this year. And they beat Trump in 2020. And then it was hard to maintain that because people are trying to live their lives, and they just lose energy. They get burned out. And I can imagine a kind of localism springing up in progressive communities that sets aside national politics and just focuses on these hyperlocal questions, whether that's like mutual aid groups or on a municipal level. But I also think that like conservative governments in places, including the federal government and state governments, are going to try to resist that. So I don't know if it'll work, but I'm interested to see if that develops.
David, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
David Graham writes for The Atlantic. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We're led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time. Hey, it's Mary again. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. Before I say goodbye for the day, quick reminder to take our listener survey that we're running this month. We want to make sure your voice is heard. Visit the show notes or slate.com/whatnextsurvey. It'll only take a few minutes, I promise. Totally painless. Thanks again. I'll see you next episode.